continue to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective.
Vamos a iniciar con el canal español, por favor. Sí.
Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos, no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the CTOUR, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo del público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
Allá al fondo tiene que estar.
No lo veo, pero si no está, no pasa nada.
Listo. ¿Listo? Buenos días, señor presidente.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm very much to inform you in the Bolivar room, we have 27 delegation present. And with that, Mr. Chairman, we are in a position to kick off our meeting of the Permanent Council. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. After the verification of the quorum by the Secretariat, I have the honor to declare open this ordinary or regular session of the Council, the Permanent Council, which has been convened to consider the issues contained in the draft agenda, distributed as document CP/OD 2535/25, which, in compliance with the provisions of Article 43 of the regulations of the Permanent Council, I put before you for your consideration. If there are no comments, we will proceed to approve it approved. My dear colleagues, before actually beginning, I would like to say on behalf of the Permanent Council and express some words of solidarity and the hope that Pope Francis recovers quickly. He's going through some health challenges right now, and that is the religion which is dominant in most of our states, and we cannot overlook the importance and the personality we're talking about, particularly this Pope. So from here, we wish him a speedy recovery and good health. Our permanent observation mission in the Holy See conveys those wishes. So, in order to make the most of the available time and ensure a fluid and well-balanced discussion on the topics that we have on our recently approved agenda, I thank you in advance for your cooperation and would like to thank all delegations that we respect the limit of 5 minutes per intervention as established by our regulations. As stated on the agenda, there will be a break at 1 p.m., and we will resume our meeting at 2:30 p.m. with the commemoration of the Day of Women in the Americas as the first item on the agenda after lunch break. Distinguished colleagues, with your permission and having made a consultation with our Secretariat and our Vice Chair for this point of utmost importance, such as the commemoration of the Day of Women in the Americas, I have taken the liberty of inviting the distinguished Vice Chair of the Permanent Council, Ambassador of El Salvador, Wendy Acevedo, so that she, as a woman and also given her vast experience in multilateralism in the Americas, that leads with great clarity to chair this afternoon session. The role of women in all aspects must always be valued and balanced vis-a-vis men in identical conditions, and that's why it seems to me fair and correct that having on the membership such a significant presence of very brave women as ambassadors, one of them is the one that will guide our meeting on this particular point. And then, my dear colleagues, next we will proceed to the presentation of the final report of the Special Observation Mission of the Organization of American States for the process of election of judges of the Supreme Court of Justice, the appeals courts, and other courts of the same category in Guatemala, in attention to the request of the Secretary General contained in document CP/INF 10428/25. I am very pleased to greet and welcome this Permanent Council to His Excellency Carlos Ramiro Martinez Alvarado, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Guatemala, who accompanies us at this meeting virtually. Mr. Minister, a warm welcome to you, to the Permanent Council of the organization. We're very honored with your very valuable presence. Colleagues, for the presentation of the report, we have also Mrs. Rosa Celorio, member of the Special Observation Mission, who will proceed to offer a summary of the report, which has been distributed as document CP/Doc 6056/25. Mrs. Celorio, welcome to the Permanent Council. I should like to give you the floor in person here in the Simon Bolivar room. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present you the final report of this mission. This mission visited Guatemala 4 times around as they follow up to the invitation of the chair, Mr. Bernardo Arevalo, between June and October 2024. All the members of our mission participated in the visits, including Mr. Romé and Roberto Gusa, and they were accompanied by His Excellency Tito from the Department of Democratic Sustainability, from the OAS, and the representation of the OAS in Guatemala. And during our visit, there were many authorities from the government and judges, as well as the president, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, organizations of civil society, international organizations such as the UNHCR, and the Group G13. We had press conferences that underscored a host of different challenges in the election of judges, both men and women alike, underscoring the importance of the constitutional timeframes for the election process and the priority to abide by international standards for human rights, and of course looking at the judicial independence in this context, which is very important for the selection of these that should be based on the merits and the objective selection criteria and the promotion of international standards of equality, non-discrimination, and transparency. We presented a preliminary report in Guatemala on the 18th of September 2024, and before this Permanent Council on Wednesday, 2nd of October 2024. We will present a host of different considerations which we find important in the final report, which will be in this presentation today. I'm going to begin with some of the positive aspects that are underscored in the report, particularly the appointments and the work of the chairs of the nominating committee of the Supreme Court of Justice and the Court of Appeals, characterized as positive, and also some of the steps that the nominating committees took to ensure that the processes were public, they were disseminated in information, and so that everyone from civil society could participate. We would also like to underscore a host of different concerns, including in the work undertaken by the nominating committees, delays, particularly in the assignment of the law deans, and a long discussion, which led to the fear that the deadlines, the constitutional deadlines, I should say, would not be abided by to confirm the judges. There was also some mistrust of the population during the process, which did not necessarily generate an environment which was propitious for the appointment of these outstanding judges, in as much as they did not want to see their careers exposed. And then, given the short time for the candidacies, there was concern as to the conflicts of interest, including some of the nominating committee people who were in the processes for these people and how the capacity competencies would be evaluated. There was consideration of experiences of these candidates, and other anti-democratic processes were considered corruption and so on and so forth. The limited role of civil society is another concern, and the indigenous communities in the work. On the nominating committees, the lack of incentives to present women, indigenous, and historically marginalized candidates as well, as presented in the justice system in Guatemala. The Congress played a critical role in the final selection of judges, men and women alike, and the confirmation thereof. But we observed a lack of opening for other actions to ensure that the election process took place transparently and publicly. Also, this mission became aware of some acts of criminalization by the public ministry for people who carried out these exercises within the framework of this process. This generated some very big pushback of civil society and other missions. And also, what we saw in this general work of the nominating committees, that despite certain candidates involved or highlighted for abuse of power, corruption, and intentions of or being involved in coup plotting, the nominating committees precluded a more detailed look of these candidates, and so they couldn't play their role as a filter for the candidates. And generally, we saw that the model for these processes had operative and structural gaps, and this required deep-seated look. So to look at and have an efficient, transparent, and truly independent process. I'm going to underscore 4 recommendations from the report. First, in the future, the selection process for judges in Guatemala should ensure that people who occupy these posts should be suitable people and have a strong commitment to democratic processes, the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. The candidates should not have any criminal record or any cases of corruption or any influence peddling record. And there has to be the guarantee that these posts of judges and magistrates are designated in accordance with the principles of international standards and that they promote independence of the judiciary. It's also important to reform the selection process of judges in the high courts on a model that is prescribed. And third, it is important to promote judicial reform, which considers that the Court of Appeals are made up of judges that belong to the judicial career, and to have concrete measures that are geared towards ensuring participation of women and other members of indigenous communities in the future selection processes for judges, including indigenous women, as well as including an intersectional, intercultural process in future election of judges processes, and eliminating all forms of discrimination. So we conclude thanking everyone. We thank everyone involved and the organizations that were involved with the members of the mission. We also thank the work done by the United Nations Rapporteur and for the judicial independence. This was an important reference point for this mission's work, and particularly we truly appreciate and thank the authorities of Guatemala for their ongoing support, the government of the United States as a main donor behind this mission. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much, Mr. Salorio. We'd like to welcome our Secretary General. And now I should like to give the floor to His Excellency Carlos Ramiro Marines Alvarado, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Excellency, once again, we'd like to warmly welcome you, and I should like to give you the floor. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, permanent members, Secretary General Luis Almagro, Assistant Secretary General Ernesto Mendez, and distinguished permanent representatives and delegates, Mrs. Rosa Celorio, member of the mission. I would like to express my deep-seated thanks to the Secretary General, Mr. Luis Almagro, for convening this meeting of the Permanent Council and to include this item on the agenda. Also, I should like to thank the technical group for all the efforts of those involved to ensure that the report was presented in a timely way and translated into all the official languages. On the 14th of January, the government of Guatemala, headed up by President Arevalo, was in his post for a year, and there were serious threats to democratic institutions there. These threats were looked at thanks to the support of the international community, and particularly the role of the Organization of American States, the OAS. Now, following this, during the transition, is proof that the people of Guatemala has not forgotten and is truly grateful. The trust of Guatemala in the OAS's integrity and the ability of the Secretary General were determinant to ask in 2024 for a special observation mission for the selection process of these judges of the Supreme Court of Justice and the Appeals Court. This mission asked for in the protocol session of the PC last year presented a key step to strengthen legitimacy, transparency of the Guatemalan judicial system. For several months, the special mission tirelessly worked to look at the granular details and the crucial points and the interests that were involved in this process. Democratic institutions of the country continue to have serious challenges and to guarantee fair and transparent processes. This is crucial to consolidate a system which is well-founded, that supports democratic, social, and economic abilities. The final report of the mission has clearly underscored crucial challenges that we have before us as we move forward. And this is to increase the participation of women as one, particularly indigenous women, when it comes to the nominating process. We have to create effective mechanisms so that we can slash conflicts of interest. We have to do away with anything that affects independence and that goes against or flies against international standards. We have to have measures to have accountability of the public ministry when it comes to power abuses, to strengthen the weights and counterweights of the democratic system to avoid any interference, any undue interference, I should say, in the nominating process. We heard about the 4 recommendations that are presented. This is a challenge. It's a big amount of work for our countries. We have to take the bull by the horns for our responsibility. The judicial reform, for example, is a pending task according to the peace agreement. And at that time, people spoke about the reform. And in consultations, there were some stakeholders who were in the government at the time, and they signed the peace agreements. And this shines light on the reform. We have to recognize the arduous work of the members of the Commission under the guidance of Mrs. Salorio, as well as Mr. Ave and the entire team for strengthening democracy in the OAS. The commitment and the effort have been crucial to analyze and understand the dynamic of this very complex process, as expressed by President Arevalo in the award ceremony awarded by Secretary Almagro, and with the OAS present for our democratic processes. There was nothing other than the firm commitment and support evinced. The Human Rights Commission moved towards independence as part of due process and human rights. This principle, also in the political constitution of Guatemala, underscores the need to share and have honorable people to shore up the judicial process. Guatemala reaffirms its commitment with transparency and accountability, taking on the commitment to implement mechanisms that speak to the processes and that strengthen citizens' trust in the institutions. On the ground, we recognize the valuable recommendations of the report, which have been already highlighted, and we work to have these incorporated in the national legislation. So in this context, multilateralism continues to be a vital tool to promote solid institutions and effective governance. These are crucial pillars for developing our society. This permanent council and accompanying this is crucial so that we can move forward. And we would like to thank those countries that have supported the mission and the commitment to strengthen democracy in Guatemala. This shows the will to work with the OAS and the international community to build a democratic society which is inclusive, strong, and free. With renewed thanks and a commitment, with these comments, I should like to also thank the Secretary General and his team for paying attention to this topic, which is of utmost importance for Guatemala, and particularly to strengthen democracies throughout the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your comments and for your very valuable participation in this meeting. Dear colleagues, moving ahead, and given the request of the Guatemala mission, I'm very happy to warmly welcome Mrs. Margaret Satterthwaite, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Independence of Judges and Lawyers. Distinguished Rapporteur, I'm very happy to meet you, and I should like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, colleagues, I would like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Guatemala, for the invitation to share remarks today on this very important occasion, the presentation of the report prepared by the OAS mission to observe the court election process in Guatemala. And I'd like to take this moment to congratulate the members of the mission on their essential work. I also extend my appreciation to each of you for attending to this crucial topic. I'd like to propose a framework that may help us understand the findings of the report. I'll first address the fundamental standards governing judicial appointments and then touch on my last two thematic reports, which focused on safeguarding these procedures from undue influence. A strong and independent judiciary is the bedrock of any democracy. It serves as the ultimate arbiter of justice, ensuring the resolution of conflicts and safeguarding individuals from abuses of power and human rights violations, and ensuring that perpetrators are held accountable under the law. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has emphasized that, quote, ultimately, without judicial independence, there is no rule of law, nor is democracy possible, since judges must have adequate and sufficient guarantees to carry out their function of resolving conflicts in society in accordance with the legal order. The lack of independence and respect for their authority is synonymous with arbitrariness. Judicial independence is not merely an abstract principle. International standards provide that judicial independence must be guaranteed by the state and enshrined in the Constitution or national law. All branches of government and institutions have a duty to respect and uphold this independence. International standards make clear the intrinsic link between judicial independence, democracy, and the rule of law, and separation of powers. In a 2009 report to the United Nations, my predecessor recalled that the principle of separation of powers, together with the rule of law, are key to the administration of justice, with a guarantee of independence, impartiality, and transparency. In a 2017 report, this mandate reaffirmed that respecting the rule of law and fostering the separation of powers and the independence of justice are prerequisites for the protection of human rights and democracy. These international standards explicitly emphasize that judicial independence refers in particular to the procedure and the qualifications for the appointment of judges, as well as to the guarantees that safeguard their tenure and decision-making autonomy. Along the same lines, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights agrees that every appointment process must serve not only to select candidates based on their merits and qualifications, but also to ensure equal opportunities for access to the judiciary. Consequently, judges must be selected exclusively based on personal merit and professional competence through objective selection and retention mechanisms that take into account the uniqueness and specificity of the functions to be performed. I take, therefore, this opportunity to highlight the importance of holding transparent, participatory, and merit-based processes to appoint the most qualified candidates to these crucial positions. In this sense, I'm particularly concerned about instances where delays or disruption hinder the timely appointments of high court judges, as well as cases in which civil society have credibly questioned the suitability of appointed candidates. To uphold the integrity of the judiciary, it is essential that all necessary measures are taken to ensure that judicial appointments comply with international human rights standards in a timely fashion, that candidates meet the established professional and ethical criteria, and that civil society is given the opportunity to participate fully and meaningfully in these processes. For all countries, active engagement in the selection of apex court justices, attorneys general, and other high-ranking judicial officers is fundamental to the preservation of justice systems. A recommendation to this effect was made by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Resolution 118. Specifically, the Commission recommended that states adopt measures to strengthen the independence, impartiality, and autonomy of justice systems by establishing regulatory frameworks for the selection and appointment process of justice operators based on objective criteria, predictable requirements and procedures for all individuals wishing to participate, and transparency mechanisms in the selection and appointment processes of justice operators, including high courts. In Guatemala, the law on nominating commissions mandates a transparent and objective process, ensuring citizen participation through social auditing. This oversight mechanism should encompass all phases of the process, from the composition of the nominating commissions to the submission of candidates to Congress and the final election of magistrates. It is here that the expert work, such as that undertaken by the OAS, is crucial. I was eager to hear the findings, especially as I prepare my upcoming official visit to Guatemala in May. The insights the OAS provides will serve as a foundation to further improve and strengthen judicial appointment processes. In my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur, I've also closely monitored this process. In April 2025, I shared a set of indicators designed to guide those involved in overseeing and monitoring the judicial appointment process. These indicators were grounded in relevant human rights law, norms, and standards. I'd like to share some insight from my thematic report on the improper influence of economic actors in the judiciary, which I presented to the UN General Assembly in October 2024. While this report is not an exhaustive study of the issue, it's intended as a wake-up call, a prompt to recognize and address this pressing concern. My report found that in states with judicial nomination or appointment bodies, economic actors may covertly obtain membership on these bodies or otherwise engage in organized schemes to direct their activities. It also found that processes for the appointment of non-judicial committee members, including lawyers, academics, and other representatives of civil society, can also become politicized with the help of economic actors. To guard against improper economic influence over judicial appointment processes, states should identify the vulnerabilities in selection processes that may allow for undue economic influence. Additionally, they should collaborate with judicial councils and judges' associations to take appropriate measures to close these gaps. Where independent judicial selection bodies exist, there should be clear selection processes and criteria for non-judicial members, and rules should be established regarding the lobbying of such committees. But the threat of undue economic influence does not end with appointment. To protect sitting judges from such pressure, states should work with judicial councils and judges' associations to ensure judges have competitive salaries and benefits, to ensure judicial governing bodies consider whether regulations are needed to govern employment following exit from the bench, to establish clear standards for the types of gifts, services, financial gains, or remunerated work that judges may undertake, or which are prohibited, to establish clear and strict rules for the disclosure of gifts and income, and finally, to require judges' financial disclosures to be made public. As I conclude, I want to reaffirm my commitment to engage with all relevant actors in Guatemala during my official country visit this May. Strengthening the independence of the judiciary is not just an institutional necessity, it is a collective responsibility. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has emphasized the important role that judges play in a democracy because, quote, they serve as guarantors of human rights. This role requires recognizing and safeguarding their independence, particularly in relation to other branches of government. Otherwise, their work could be hindered to the extent that it becomes impossible for them to determine, declare, and if necessary, sanction the arbitrariness of acts that violate these rights. I appreciate the opportunity to take part in this discussion, and I thank you all for your kind attention. I'm very pleased to then turn my attention back to the presenters and to look forward to very carefully taking into account the findings of the mission. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much to the Special Rapporteur, Ms. Margaret Satterthwaite, for these very valuable insights for all of our countries. Colleagues, I would now like to offer the floor to all delegations who wish to speak about the report that has just been presented.
Tiene la palabra la de...
I offer the floor to the delegation of Colombia. Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. My delegation would like to express its thanks for the presentation given by Ms. Rosa Solorio and for the statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Guatemala, as well as the remarks by the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. I would like to also thank the mission for its work, as well as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for selecting judges for the Supreme Court of Justice and Appeals Courts in Guatemala. I was lucky enough to have worked with Rosa in the past, and we are very familiar with the work that she does, and we're grateful for it. This mission shows that our region is firmly committed to the principles of transparency, justice, democracy, and human rights. We celebrate the fact that the government administration of President Arevalo extended a special invitation to the observation mission and essentially to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in order to provide support for this process. We look forward to welcoming the president in Colombia. We hope that a visit can be paid in 2025. The administration of President Petro is fully committed to upholding and protecting human rights with political plurality, and it reaffirms its support for the separation of powers and the rule of law, which is required for the full independence and autonomy of officials in the judiciary. For this reason, the final report of the mission and the Commission recalls the importance of continuing to strengthening these institutions in our countries and enacting reforms to strengthen the judiciary, combating corruption, and putting in place equitable forms of justice that are also impartial and independent. The question that we can ask ourselves about this is, why must we demand this from the judiciary? Why must we have this independence and transparency? Well, we need to make sure that those institutions are solid. We also need to make sure that judges act with integrity and total independence and impartiality, and without political bias of any type. That will ensure that when judges carry out their work, they are putting aside their religious and political beliefs. And that's why we have a constitution and laws. This is why their independence is so important. In Colombia, an unfortunate decision was taken in 1991 that affected the judicial branch. And this had to do with appointments of high-level positions in the government, of the fiscal institutions of the country. And as we have said before the Constitutional Court, this was a treacherous gift, so to speak, because what happened was people started to exchange favors within these institutions. And we need to make sure that we have safeguards in place to avoid this type of situation. We have always advocated for this. Guatemala is very similar to Colombia in this respect. We have always worked to ensure that you don't have a judicial branch that becomes a sort of political party with political influence. This is something that we absolutely cannot allow. It was useful to hear the recommendations of the report, which address the reforms of the nominating committees, as well as the need to have affirmative measures to allow the inclusion of women and people from indigenous groups in the judicial system. This is something that we are advocating for today, and I say this also to the special rapporteur. The issue of gender equality is something that we are working to enforce within our high courts. The Supreme Court of Justice was always the highest level of our judiciary. It has 23 members, but only 5 women and 18 men. That really should not be allowed. So what we need to do, we need to create a balance. We need to create gender parity to make sure, and as has been said before, this is a time for women, and we need to make sure that this is reflected in high courts. We need to make sure that this type of imbalance is addressed. We cannot continue to tolerate this. We cannot tolerate this discrimination against women. This goes back to the work on gender equality that the government is doing, and that needs to be applied across the board, especially in the judiciary. We need to have a truly independent judiciary that is free from influence. That is a long-term complex challenge, but we trust that regional cooperation, political dialogue, will help us ensure that our judicial systems reflect the values that we all share. That is justice, equity, and respect for human rights. Thank you very much, Chair. I thank the Ambassador of Colombia, and I now offer the floor to the Ambassador of Chile. Thank you very much, Chair. I would also like to express my thanks for the remarks that were just given. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, the UN Special Rapporteur, and Ms. Celorio. We thank her especially for her commitment to the various initiatives to the work of this council and its subsidiary bodies. We wanted to stress a couple of important points. We'd like to recognize the openness that was shown by the government of Guatemala to receive the mission and its recommendations in order to improve democracy and the rule of law in that country. This is especially important when we think about the important content of the report, as well as the work that is done by special rapporteurs. As was stated by the special rapporteur a moment ago, it is crucial to have this independence of the judiciary and its judges. The report recommends best practices that can actually be relevant for all of our states when it comes to our justice systems, women's participation of indigenous groups. In that regard, we are pleased to see that the government in Guatemala is ready to take these recommendations on board and implement them. We know that in many of our countries, there is a long path ahead. There is always room to improve our democracies, to make them healthier, stronger, and more inclusive. And sometimes that means recognizing that we need to change our practices. And I think that some of our challenges are more shared than they might seem at first glance. It's also interesting to note the work that is being done with the UN, and I think we can strengthen that work and strengthen our cooperation. We want to make sure that we continue to discuss this topic and the transition in Guatemala. This is work that needs to be done with states through dialogue. That is the best path to continue working on these challenges that we all share. Thank you, Chair. I thank Chile. I offer the floor to Canada. Thank you, Chair. Canada would like to thank all of the presenters today, particularly Ms. Rosa Solorio, as well as the Special Observation Mission for their exceptional work. The final report to the Permanent Council is extremely useful. Canada is deeply committed to the principles of democracy, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary, not only in Guatemala, but throughout the world.
An independent judiciary is vital for ensuring accountability, fostering trust in governance, and safeguarding individual rights. Canada's support for this mission is unwavering, and we encourage all efforts to protect and strengthen these institutions, which serve as the cornerstone of just and equitable societies. We are particularly pleased with the report's recommendations to enhance inclusion, especially the call for greater representation of women and Indigenous peoples. Promoting the nomination of candidates from underrepresented groups is crucial to advancing equity in governance. Thank you again to Ms. Rosa Solorio for presenting the final report. The recommendations based on this mission's pioneering work will play a critical role in informing and guiding the OAS's continued engagement and support to member states' efforts in enhancing their judicial independence and democratic institutions. Thank you, Chair.
Gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Canada. I now offer the floor to the Assistant Secretary General, or Secretary General, rather. The interpreter corrects herself. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to express my gratitude to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Guatemala, Mr. Carlos Ramiro Martinez, for his statement and for the trust placed in the General Secretariat with respect to this mission. I would also like to recognize the remarks by the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. And special thanks to Ms. Rosa Solorio for presenting this report, and to the Observation Mission for the selection of judges for the Supreme Court of Justice and appeals courts and courts of equal rank in Guatemala. I'd like to thank the members of the mission for their work as well. As we heard in the presentation of the report, the mission supported this process by promoting the highest international standards, which are fundamental for such processes of selection, so that they are transparent and help avoid subjectivity and politicization. As stated in Article 3 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the separation and independence of branches of government is an essential aspect of representative democracy. In that regard, the selection of judges is especially important, because this should ensure that judges become judges based on their skills and that they are independent when carrying out their work. The suitability and autonomy of judges strengthens the rule of law, and in addition, it protects democracy. Guatemala is facing democratic challenges that are significant. The General Secretariat has observed this. At times, institutions have been used to weaken these same institutions, which affects governance and undermines the work being done. The OAS has an ongoing presence in Guatemala and has redoubled its efforts through its electoral observation missions and special missions, such as the one for the selection of judges, in order to support Guatemalan society in its efforts to promote peace and strengthen democratic institutions, as well as promote the values and principles of the organization. Now, despite the significant progress achieved, in reality, there are challenges that persist and that endanger the country's democratic system. The selection process of judges has historically been marked by political influence, and there has been influence from political parties as well as clientelism. Now, there have been reforms and amendments to the law on the nominating committees, as well as the law on access to public information. However, corruption and impunity continue to undermine the selection process for judges. As was mentioned before, international standards require objectivity and impartiality when it comes to selecting these judges. However, the mission has seen with concern that these standards are not always upheld. One of the factors that has weakened the judicial system in Guatemala is how the nominating committees are set up. Instead of focusing on merit and transparency, these committees have created incentives that encourage political operators to get involved in the selection of judges. And we have seen this in various courts, and these nominating committees have been used in this fashion, which has affected the Court of Justice and the appeals courts, and has led to conflicts of interest, which we can see when votes and favors are exchanged between these nominating committees. We hope that Guatemala will adopt processes to select judges that ensures that they are suitable, honorable, and firmly attached to the principles of democracy and human rights. The integrity of the judicial system depends on the fact that judges have no link to influence peddling or corruption. They must not be manipulated by political parties, and they need to make sure that there is no impunity. An independent judiciary is an essential prerequisite for the stability of any democracy, the protection of fundamental rights, and citizens' trust in their institutions. The selection process must also reflect democratic values so that those who are meting out justice are firmly committed to the rule of law. Strengthening democracy in Guatemala requires significant reforms to be implemented. We will support any such efforts that will ensure that democracy in Guatemala upholds equity and protection for all citizens. My very sincere thanks to everyone who made the work of this mission possible. Your cooperation was key for these activities. I'd especially like to thank the authorities of the Guatemalan government and other institutions that met with the members of the mission. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Secretary General. Distinguished colleagues, seeing no further requests for the floor, the Chair suggests that the Permanent Council take note of the final report of the Special Observation Mission of the OAS for the selection of judges for the Supreme Court of Justice and appeals courts in Guatemala, as well as other courts of equal rank, contained in document CP Doc 6056/25, and we express our thanks to Ms. Rosa Salorio and other members of the mission, as well as the team from the Department of Democratic Sustainability and Special Missions of the General Secretariat for the work that they carried out in Guatemala. We also reiterate our thanks to His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Guatemala for his participation in today's meeting, as well as to Ms. Margaret Satterthwaite, Special Rapporteur from the UN on the independence of judges and lawyers, and thank you also to all delegations that made remarks. In recent times, having courts with judges that are suitable and selected through transparent merit-based election processes is key for the institutions in our countries, the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Once again, we recognize the merit of the report presented and the excellent work behind it. Seeing no objections, it is so agreed. Agreed. Colleagues, the next item on our order of business is in keeping with the mandate set out in Resolution 3028 of the General Assembly. This is contributions of member states toward counteracting intolerance and discrimination in the region. Promoting equality, respect for human rights, and social inclusion are fundamental pillars for the development of fair and democratic societies. Combating these phenomena is not just an ethical responsibility, it is an imperative to strengthen the rule of law and social cohesion in each and every one of our countries. There is no work more noble, dignified, or just for multilateralism than promoting equality amongst all human beings and eliminating all forms of discrimination. For this reason, it is key that member states work together to implement concrete measures that eradicate any form of discrimination, promote effective public policies that promote full integration of all individuals regardless of their origin, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or any other characteristic. In that regard, we express our deepest thanks to the Permanent Mission of Mexico, specifically Ambassador Luz Elena Baños, for her work and firm commitment to implementation of this mandate. To begin our discussions on this topic, I am very pleased to offer the floor to the distinguished Ambassador, Ambassador Baños. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair. Mexico is honored to have presented this section of the Omnibus Resolution on promoting human rights at the previous General Assembly, which sets forth a mandate for the Permanent Council to address this topic. We are very grateful to the Chair for being open to including this item on today's order of business. We also recognize the participation in this panel of Commissioner Andrea Pochak from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, as well as Ms. Betilde Munoz, the Director of the Department of Social Inclusion, as well as Mr. Carlos Quesada, Executive Director of the Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Their voices are much appreciated here. We would also like to recognize the presence of the Executive Secretariat of the IACHR, Tania Herreno. Mexico's commitment to equality and non-discrimination is a constitutional mandate that has a historic basis. On 14 February, our first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum, signed a decree to recognize the first president of African descent to promote various policies. And it was through this decree that slavery was abolished in Mexico in the 1800s. And this is in keeping with other traditions that go back hundreds of years. The fight for equality and non-discrimination has strengthened gradually over time. The first article of our Constitution says as much. It prevents any type of discrimination and says that this is a sign of the health of our democracy. It is also a key element to promote our national sovereignty, which we have defended decisively for centuries. Our long history of fighting to claim rights in 2003 and the promotion of the federal law to eliminate discrimination. From that time, various reforms have added elements and enriched these texts. We have also worked to harmonize our legislation with the highest international standards. The first article defines discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference that, intentionally or not, is not subjective, rational, or proportionate, the outcome of which is to create obstacles or undermine the recognition or enjoyment of human rights and freedoms. When this occurs, we have to also recognize other forms of discrimination that have to do with disability, gender, sexual orientation, physical or mental health, sexual preference, civil status, family status, language, criminal records, just to mention a few. It also establishes that discrimination is defined as homophobia and misogyny, any form of xenophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as racial segregation and other forms of intolerance. Starting in December 2023, thanks to a recent reform in Mexico, this law includes a definition of intersectional discrimination, when there are two or more forms of discrimination that intersect and amplify the discriminatory effect. In addition, it states other definitions, including direct and indirect discrimination, systemic and discrimination, and discrimination based on association. These laws enable various institutions to carry out a survey on discrimination, which was published in 2022. And it identified various groups, including people of African descent, indigenous groups, elderly people, children, adolescents, and youth, women who work outside of the home, employees, and other groups. The outcomes of this survey show awareness of these gaps with respect to the rights of these groups, as well as the overwhelming opinion of the majority in favor of equality. Recently, the administration in Mexico, working with CONAPRED and the OAS, published a text on racism and discrimination and intolerance. And it addresses some of the challenges. You can find this text online. It was published 2 years ago. But this document has become even more important and relevant, and is especially important in today's context, but it includes new definitions and language contributed by states to improve the understanding of the complex realities that continue to create obstacles to our development and the eradication of racism. The Inter-American system has worked to further protect the international human rights. After 8 years of long negotiations, in 2013, 2 instruments were adopted: the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance, as well as the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. Mexico has been party to both conventions, and through these conventions, we were able to ratify in 2020 the instrument that allowed its entry into effect in our country.
To underscore the importance of both treaties, I should like to underscore a key point in Advisory Commission 18/17, 2003. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights determines that the principle of equality before the law, equal protection before the law, and non-discrimination in the current stage of the evolution of international law went into jus cogens, and I quote, "In as much as this covers the entire legal scaffolding in international law, and it is a crucial principle that permeates the entire legal arena," end quote. The legal dictionaries that we have in CD and CIRBI are a demonstration of the progress made in our region and are a very innovative contribution to the overall thoughts geared towards eradicating exclusion, inequality, and discrimination. Mexico truly appreciates and thanks member states, both permanent observers, agencies and entities of the OAS, and particularly the IACHR and the Department of Social Integration, as well as civil society organizations for the tireless work to prevent and eradicate all forms of discrimination. We uphold our respect for all member states and urge all member states who have not done so to adhere to and or ratify both American conventions and to double up their efforts when it comes to attention to historically marginalized and discriminated populations in our region. Mr. Chairman, Mexico reiterates its commitment and abides by the principle of equality with a view towards gender mainstreaming, intersectionality, and the principles of universality, indivisibility, and progression, and not regression of human rights, remembering that all human beings are born free and equal with dignity and with rights. And our voice, our decisions, and our actions should reflect this essential principle. We reaffirm our entire commitment with an America without discrimination and without any intolerance. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ambassador Baños. Next, I should like to warmly greet and give the floor to Commissioner Andrea Pochak, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Commissioner Pochak, you have the floor. Good morning to everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. On behalf of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I extend my warm regards and greetings to the President or the Chair of the Permanent Council, Permanent Representative of Bolivia, Ambassador Hector Enrique Arce Saconeta. I should also like to greet the Vice Chair of the Permanent Council, Permanent Representative of El Salvador, Ambassador Wendy Acevedo, the Permanent Representative of Mexico, Ambassador Luis Elena Baños Rivas, ambassadors, permanent representatives and alternates to the OAS, Secretary General Luis Almagro, and Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez, Secretary of Access to Rights and Equity of the General Secretary of the OAS, Maria Carmen Plata, Executive Director of the Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights, Carlos Quesada, and the peoples of the Americas and the Caribbean who accompany this work. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights appreciates the opportunity to participate in this session of the Permanent Council and values the willingness of member states and to continue contributing to the development of effective strategies against intolerance and discrimination. This session deserves special words for Guatemala from the Inter-American Commission. I wouldn't want to make some brief comments on the importance of continuing the enormous challenge for the judiciary in Guatemala. Let me go back then to my words. This session takes place at a critical moment for humanity and especially for our region, in which deep gaps in inequality, authoritarian and xenophobic discourses, and the impulse of regressive public policies in many of our countries put the full validity of human rights at risk and undermine the foundations of democracy. The annual reports of the IACHR show with objective data that historical and systemic inequalities continue to generate serious human rights violations in the Inter-American region. In its daily work, through the case and petition system and the monitoring system, the Commission listens firsthand to those who face the greatest barriers of exclusion and marginalization due to their gender, age, racial ethnicity, sexual orientation, language, religion, opinion, social background, economic position, human mobility, disability, and other social conditions. For quite a few years now, we have been facing economic crises, exacerbated after the pandemic, authoritarian speeches and actions that threaten democratic institutionality are there as well, and the measurable impacts of climate change caused by human beings are on our minds. These challenges come to further make the pre-existing conditions of human beings already affected by discrimination and intolerance. From the IACHR standpoint, however, we have also documented and celebrated important government initiatives aimed at reversing intolerance and discrimination. This shows that reversing these historical patterns and facing current challenges is possible with a firm political will and an unwavering commitment to the democratic promise to guarantee rights and opportunities on equal terms. In this regard, in the face of critical moments, forceful responses are expected from the inter-American community to address intolerance and discrimination. It is not with restrictions or suspensions of rights that we will be able to respond to the demands of people, much less strengthen democracy. The effective guarantee of rights on equal terms cannot be postponed without jeopardizing the stability and the future of our democracies. Nor is it with less multilateralism or less regional cooperation that societies will achieve gender equality and less intolerance. It is through strict compliance with international obligations derived from various sources of international human rights law. Therefore, much more so in critical moments, our respectful invitation goes out to the states of the OAS, and that is to continue strengthening the legal system that governs us through the adoption of instruments focused on the needs of the groups most affected by intolerance and discrimination. The two Inter-American Conventions Against Discrimination and Intolerance are historic advances for the protection of human rights and for the very strength of democracies. And therefore, I reiterate the concern of the IACHR given the low ratification rate of these conventions. The Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance is centered on victims of racism, racial discrimination, and other related forms of intolerance, including people of African descent, indigenous peoples, as well as other racial, ethnic, or affected groups and minorities by discrimination based on their national or ethnic lineage or origin. This instrument addresses ethnic racial issues that have not been addressed in other treaties. Its ratification is essential. For its part, the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance maintains a commitment of states to ensure that their political and legal systems adequately reflect diversity within their societies in order to meet the special legitimate needs of each sector of the population. This convention provides protections for all individuals and human groups who have not been affected by the treaties, including protections against less visible forms of discrimination, such as indirect discrimination. It is clear that the adoption of legal instruments must be accompanied by proper implementation. To this end, states and civil society have the permanent support of this Inter-American Commission, which never will abandon its mandate to stimulate human rights awareness in the peoples of the Americas. For 65 years now, our institution has fulfilled its mandate in the face of dictatorships, authoritarianism, democratic crises, and the systemic challenges brought by intolerance and discrimination. Despite various limitations, the IACHR has demonstrated unwavering conviction and capacity to help states transform realities for individuals and groups marked by intolerance and discrimination. In times of critical challenges for the region and for our institution in particular, we come to reiterate to the illustrious member states and civil society the firm and unwavering commitment of the Inter-American Commission to promote and defend human rights. In our work, eradication of intolerance and discrimination is a priority. Finally, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reiterates its call to states and societies to continue putting their bets on multilateralism, which allows forums like this in which effective strategies are analyzed to respect and guarantee human rights in compliance with the ideals that sustain our organization, and reiterating the will of the Inter-American Commission to continue contributing through our work and permanent follow-up with technical rigor and full independence with the aim of eradicating intolerance and discrimination in all its manifestations. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Commissioner Pochak, for your participation, for your very valuable contribution to this dialogue. Next, I'm very happy to greet and give the floor to Ms. Betty Munoz Pogosian, Director of the Department of Social Inclusion of the OAS General Secretariat, who is here in the room. Mrs. Betty Munoz, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everybody. I first and foremost would like to thank the Mission of Mexico to the OAS for promoting the mandate in Resolution 3028 on protection and promotion of human rights and their section, particularly on the Inter-American Convention against racism, racial discrimination, and all related forms of intolerance. And as such, then, given the kind invitation of the Secretariat, I'm very happy to be part of this important Permanent Council session. I would like to warmly greet Secretary Maria Carmen Plata and reiterate the commitment on this work, on this issue. From the side, we think it's really very important saying that racism, discrimination, and intolerance are not things from the past. On the contrary, these scourges are still present today, and this is something that promotes and drives our work in the OAS, and it should continue to be a priority, particularly considering that the consequence of these ills is the exclusion of millions of people who belong to groups that are historically marginalized in the Americas. Since its foundation in 1948, the organization proscribes discrimination because of race, nationality, creed, or sex, and even though states are in on this, we have done everything to eliminate these problems, although there's still a lot of ground to cover. So given this situation, the OAS has drafted a host of different instruments in inter-American organizations that aim to counter, more specifically, racism, discrimination, and intolerance. These include the instruments that have already been mentioned, the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Discrimination, and all connected or related forms of intolerance, the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance, the Inter-American Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against People with Disabilities, and the Program for People with Disabilities, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Plan of Action, as well as the Plan of Action for the Decade of Afro-Descendants in the Americas. And precisely, the Department of Social Inclusion, the SADE, offers its support in compliance with the mandate of the OAS regarding respect for groups who are in vulnerable situations, and calls for signature ratification implementation through public policies. In addition to the work that is being done in this regard, from the SADE standpoint, we also would like to support the public employees in its work against discrimination. And a relevant example for our discussion today is the support that we provide to the Inter-American Network of High Authorities on policies for Afro-descendant populations. This is called REAFRO. And as you all well know, REAFRO is the specialized mechanism for dialogue, coordination, permanent ongoing cooperation amongst national authorities in the Americas to promote implementation of policies for Afro-descendant populations according to international obligations, regional duties based on the principles which are recognition, justice, and development. On the other hand, SADE also has provided support to the informal working group to present a proposal for the Inter-American Declaration to promote human rights for people, Afro-descendant communities of the Americas, a group which is made up of 11 member states and co-chaired by Colombia and Brazil. In this regard, then, tomorrow, We will be supporting the advisory or consultation session, as well as with other organizations from the Americas on the topics to be included and to be considered in the draft declaration. On the other hand, it is key to underscore that we also support compliance with the mandate from the General Assembly on establishing a working group to implement the American Declaration on Indigenous People, which is known as the Working Group DADIN. This will be the arena to analyze and oversee or monitor the progress made in the hemisphere when it comes to the implementation of this instrument and to propose opportunities for cooperation to exchange experiences amongst member states to or for compliance. In this regard, then, we will also be in negotiations to hold the first plenary regular session of the Dadin Working Group in Guatemala. Now, very briefly, with regard to persons with disabilities, I would like to underscore and remind you that the Department of Social Inclusion is also the technical secretariat of the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against People with Disabilities, otherwise known as CEDIS. And we have also provided support to the group of friends of people with disabilities in the OAS. So to complement this work and in accordance with the mandates and coordinated with authorities of all governments, we have also provided and generated discussions and other products that have led to awareness raising on these issues. Another example of this work is the webinar, Afro-Descendant Women Who Are Resilient and Diverse. This is a webinar which aims at giving voice to Afro-descendant women and looks at intersectionality as well as it analyzes the different work done by various institutions. So to close then, Mr. Chairman, and rounding off my words and going back to the topic of conventions, I'd like to give you an overview of all of the ratifications. Thus far, 6 member states of 32 have ratified the Inter-American Convention Against Racism. 3 members have ratified the convention that is linked to all forms of discrimination and intolerance. That is to say, 32 have ratified. Now 12 states are part of REAFRO, 13 work in public policy, and 32 member states are part of the group of Friends of People with Disabilities. Now, although this is no guarantee that discrimination will be automatically eradicated from the OAS standpoint, we truly value those countries who continue to prioritize these issues and who continue to ratify these instruments on rights and who continue to participate in as much as from this leadership standpoint we can continue to achieve the goals for inclusion and access for all people. So with that then, Mr. Chairman, we reiterate our commitment to continue to work as we fight racial discrimination, intolerance, and to promote rights for groups that are historically marginalized and discriminated against. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Munoz Gocian. Thank you very much for your commitment to social inclusion in the region. Dear colleagues, once again, I'm very happy to give the floor and greet Mr. Carlos Quesada, Executive Director of the Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. Mr. Quesada, you have the floor virtually. Sir, can you please ask for the floor?
El icono azul que está en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla.
Mr. Quesada, are you tuned in? Can you hear us? We cannot hear you.
Distinguidos colegas, parece que tenemos problemas de conexión.
Colleagues, we've got some connections problems. We don't have him on the screen. We've got some connectivity problems here, says the chairman. Well, unfortunately, this is sad, so I should like to give the floor to delegations who might like to make some comments on this particular item on the agenda. The delegation of Antigua and Barbuda has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Antigua and Barbuda welcomes this discussion on the contributions of member states in counteracting intolerance and discrimination in our region. We thank the delegation of Mexico for requesting this important item on today's agenda, and we thank you, Chair, for including it. We also thank the speakers who we've heard this morning for their very insightful and passionate remarks. We also acknowledge the efforts of the inter-American community in upholding the fundamental principles of equality, human dignity, and respect for all. It is a moral imperative enshrined in international law and human decency that we reject intolerance and discrimination in all their forms. Antigua and Barbuda has known throughout our own history the devastating impact of racial injustice, systemic discrimination, and colonial oppression. We've also experienced the resilience of the human spirit in overcoming such injustices. The legacy of these struggles, however, continue to inform our unyielding commitment to forging societies based on inclusivity, respect, and equal opportunity. Mr. Chair, as you know, Antigua and Barbuda was the first member state of the OAS to sign and ratify the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and related forms of intolerance. That is a fact about which we are very proud. But it remains a matter of sadness and disappointment for us that almost 13 years later, only 6 of our member states have deposited the instruments of accession or ratification to this important Convention Against Racism. Since the Convention needs 10 states to deposit their instruments before the implementing machinery of the Convention can be activated, the Convention remains mere words on parchment, noble ideals that have not been realized. Therefore, it gives rise to a judgment about how serious are our countries when we make statements protesting racism, racial discrimination, and related forms of intolerance, but we do little to implement the machinery. Once again, Mr. Chairman, Antigua and Barbuda calls on all delegations to remove this blemish on the record of the Organization of American States. Let us move this organization beyond a forum for talk, for declarations, and for statements to one of meaningful action. These conventions mark significant steps toward codifying our collective aspirations for a more just and equitable hemisphere. Yet we must recognize that conventions alone do not transform societies. Actions do. Despite the progress made, our region remains marred by persistent racial and ethnic inequalities, discrimination against migrants, the marginalization of indigenous peoples, gender-based discrimination, and the rise of xenophobia. These injustices corrode the very foundations of democracy and human rights that the OAS was established to protect. The work before us, Mr. Chairman, is very far from over. These instruments are not symbolic. They are frameworks for real, tangible change. They demand policies that dismantle structural discrimination, promote social cohesion, and ensure that every individual, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, disability, religion, sexual orientation, or any other status, can live free from oppression, and I might add, Mr. Chairman, free from depression. In our own national context, Antigua and Barbuda has championed legal and policy measures to safeguard against discrimination. We continue to advocate for the empowerment of marginalized groups, from our youth and women to persons with disabilities and mental health challenges. But we too know much work needs to be done in educating sectors of our own society, particularly religious communities, on LGBTQI+ communities. We continue that work in earnest, despite the obstacles, most of which are imported into our region. Mr. Chair, in our collective fight against intolerance, we must be vigilant. Hate has found new spaces in which to thrive, especially in this digital age. The proliferation of disinformation, racism, and intolerance on social media platforms, and indeed from authoritative global figures, presents new challenges that require coordinated responses. We call upon the OAS and its member states to enhance strategies to combat the spread of hate speech, ensuring that freedom of expression is not weaponized to undermine the dignity and security of vulnerable persons. In closing, Antigua and Barbuda reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a hemisphere where diversity is not just tolerated, but celebrated. Our democratic values can only be strengthened, Mr. Chairman, by ensuring that every person is treated with the dignity and equality they deserve. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al embajador.
Thank you very much to the Ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. We truly appreciate the delegation of Mexico for having included this point on the agenda. And we thank all the contributions we heard this morning. Brazil believes that a true democracy should promote equality, opportunity for everyone, and guarantee the popular participation in public policies. Our priority is to promote, protect rights for vulnerable people and give voice and opportunity to those who, for historical reasons, had their rights denied or restricted, such as women, children, Afro-descendants, indigenous communities, and people with disabilities, and the LGBTQ plus street people and stateless people as well. We make international efforts and look at racial discrimination, and we have spearheaded negotiations that have led to the approval of the second International Decade for Afro-Descendants in December 2024. And we have proposed an ODF on equality and racial equality. We ratified the Inter-American Convention in 2021 against racism, and we had a constitutional amendment promoting protection and promotion of human rights. The last General Assembly of OAS, alongside Colombia, we proposed, and we had achieved approval so that we had basis for looking at rights of Afro-descendants, and we set up the informal working group in the last few months has looked at the topics that have to be considered in the new declaration in the future. As regards the Afro-descendant population, to reduce lethal violence against Black young people, the Minister of Racial Equality developed a plan to slash and promote public policies for young Black people. Brazil has traditionally been very active when it comes to promoting and protecting rights for LGBTQ plus people, both national as well as internationally. We abide by or are part of the Equal Rights Coalition and the group of friends of the mandates that are specialists that look at gender issues in the Council of Human Rights in Geneva. We believe that there should be joint efforts by all countries with a view to renewing the mandate of the Council in 2025. Brazil believes that the combat and the fight against LGBTQ people a priority. We have to prioritize decriminalization, I'm sorry, says the speaker, decriminalization of intimate relationships of same-sex people in the entire world. And we are kicking off a process of ratifying the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance that Brazil signed in 2023. We are concerned with the rise that criminalizes our communities. We have shown support to those countries that decriminalize intimate relations amongst people of the same sex in Latin America and in the Caribbean. The look at LGBTQ people in 2023 plans to combat violence against LGBTQ plus people, and we want to promote health programs for this population in our system. I would like to reaffirm the long-standing commitment that Brazil has to protect rights of indigenous communities. Our Constitution of 1988 recognizes the rights that indigenous communities have. They can organize socially, they can honor their own traditions and customs. We continue to support adoption of this issue, such as the Inter-American Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and the Declaration of the United Nations on Rights of Human Indigenous People. We have Sonia Guajajara, a minister. She is the Minister for the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in the Latin America and the Caribbean. We also were very happy to elect the Executive Secretary in the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, Mr. Oloy, for the work that is responsible for implementing the American Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples from the OAS. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the Ambassador of Brazil. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Costa Rica. A very good morning, Chair, permanent representatives, Secretary General, delegates. We wanted to express our thanks to the delegation of Mexico for having asked to include this item on today's order of business, specifically Ambassador Luz Elena Baños. We'd also like to thank the panelists for their very valuable contributions to our discussion today. Committed to human rights, democracy, and inclusion, we are taking part in this session to share with member states the efforts that our country is making to combat intolerance and discrimination. Costa Rica has worked to strengthen its robust regulatory framework to fight discrimination and intolerance. We've adopted a law on gender equity and a law against racial discrimination. In line with this commitment, we have implemented a national strategy to prevent and address hate speech and discrimination. This is a comprehensive initiative that seeks to address the proliferation of hate speech in public and digital spaces. This strategy stresses education, awareness raising, and the promotion of democratic values. At the same time, it strengthens reporting mechanisms and mechanisms for access to justice for victims of discrimination. It also strengthens interagency coordination on existing policies to focus on the needs of Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, and migrants. Based on this national policy for a society free of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related forms of intolerance. 2014-2025. Working to fight discrimination is a cross-cutting objective of the entire Costa Rican government. We work actively to protect and promote the human rights of vulnerable communities and address various forms of exclusion that they face. To that end, we have strengthened consultation and participation mechanisms to make sure that these populations have a voice in policy development and decision-making that affects their well-being. We believe that inclusion is a process that must cover all people facing systemic barriers to exercising their fundamental rights. Our country has reaffirmed our commitment to full participation by peoples with disabilities which account for some 16% of our population, according to a recent survey in 2024. We recognize that education on human rights is a key pillar to eradicate intolerance and discrimination. That is why we promoted educational programs and activities to foster a culture of respect, protection, and guarantees of human rights, so that we have inclusive spaces where all people are able to flourish. To that end, we reaffirm our belief in multilateralism as a key tool for combating intolerance. In that regard, we also reiterate our commitment to international cooperation and fulfillment of OAS mandates, as well as implementation of recommendations from all human rights entities. Chair, we call upon all member states to join efforts to eradicate all forms of discrimination and to promote the values of respect and equality. Building more fair and inclusive societies is a collective task that requires decisive action on the part of our governments and cooperation from all parts of society. Costa Rica will continue to promote the dignity and fundamental rights of all peoples without any distinction. Thank you. I thank the Ambassador of Costa Rica. I offer the floor to the Ambassador of Colombia. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to thank the delegation of Mexico under the leadership of Ambassador Luz Helena Baños for including this important item on today's agenda. And we express our support for her excellent remarks. We would also like to recognize the invaluable contributions of Commissioner Andrea Bochak, Ms. Betilde Munoz, and Mr. Carlos, those two speakers, for all of the work that they have done, especially at the Department of Social Inclusion. The Colombian government's policies recognize that human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent, which means that we must uphold the right civil, cultural, economic, and environmental rights without discrimination. Our President, Gustavo Petro, on behalf of the Colombian government, has worked to transform our country into a powerhouse that promotes life. Our history shows us that dialogue, justice, and respect for human rights are essential to that end and to achieve a dignified life for all Colombians. We are a multicultural and multi-ethnic country that is committed to recognizing and protecting this diversity. That is why we reject all forms of racial discrimination and its impacts on Afro-descendants, as well as racist practices that unfortunately persist in our country. In that regard, our government, under the leadership of our Vice President, has promoted a policy on reparations to repair the impact on various communities, including Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. To that end, we've created a National Commission on Historic Reparations in order to address the effects of racism and colonialism. We urge all states in the region to join this effort as we work together to redress these historic inequalities. We firmly believe that this collective action will create societies that are more equitable and more inclusive. Colombia has committed to transform these racist structures that we have inherited from colonialism and to promote human rights. And we also call upon countries to address the impacts of colonialism and slavery that have led to inequalities and marginalization. We reaffirm our commitment to the defense of life and territories of indigenous peoples. That is why we are working on rural agrarian reform to address land distribution and ownership to help farmer communities and indigenous groups carry out their work in a sustainable and dignified way. And we hope that Congress will support this initiative. In addition, we recognize indigenous guardians as a key mechanism to reduce violence against their leaders and communities. Colombia has ratified the agreement of Escazú, the first agreement that protects environmental defenders, an important area of progress for indigenous peoples protecting our ecosystems. This was achieved during the administration of Mr. Gustavo Petro. Lastly, we'd like to use this opportunity to underscore efforts that we are making to promote the adoption of an Inter-American Declaration on the Rights of Afro-Descendant Peoples and Communities. Tomorrow, as was announced by Batilde a moment ago, we will have a meeting of the informal group on Afro-descendants, where member states of the OAS can present topics that they consider to be a priority for the future declaration. We have opened this meeting to all members, not just to members of the informal group, and we hope to have your valuable participation. This meeting will take place tomorrow in the San Martin room in the afternoon. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much to the Ambassador of Colombia. I offer the floor to the Ambassador of Paraguay. Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to send a special greeting to the Secretary General and to all OAS representatives, as well as the permanent representatives here. Good morning to all. We would like to express our thanks to the delegation of Mexico under the leadership of Luz Elena Baños for including such an important topic on today's order of business for the Permanent Council. This is undoubtedly one of the most important discussions that our society can have, given that democracy is based on the equality of all people. This is set out in the Constitution of my country, which was approved in 1992. It recognizes equal rights and non-discrimination and says that it is the task of the state to remove obstacles that lead to discrimination. In that framework, the government of Paraguay has worked to ensure equality and access to justice, as well as access to equality under the law, access to unelected civil service positions based on the requirements of suitability and equal opportunity to benefit from nature and culture. We have also recognized equality of civil, social, economic, and cultural rights among men and women. However, we are aware that enormous gaps persist when it comes to overcoming these perceptions, which disproportionately and unfairly affect indigenous peoples, peoples with disabilities, children, and the elderly. These are issues that the government is currently working on and developing programs for to address these situations. Now, there is a tremendous amount of work still to be done, but we are firmly committed to these public policies that broaden access to rights for these vulnerable groups, such that we can have a Paraguay that is more sustainable and inclusive. Thank you very much, Chair. I thank the Ambassador of Paraguay. I offer the floor to the delegation of Bolivia. Thank you very much, Chair. We would like to thank the presenters for their remarks, particularly the distinguished delegation of Mexico for including this topic on today's order of business. The plurinational state of Bolivia, in its constitution, promotes the defense of human, civil, economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, including the prohibition and punishment of all forms of discrimination and racism. It also establishes the main functions of the government, including the responsibility to build a fair, harmonious society free from colonialism and the patriarchy, and without discrimination or exploitation, with full social justice. In this framework, since October of 2010, we have a law on racism and all forms of discrimination. Its goal is to create mechanisms and procedures to prevent and punish acts of racism and all forms of discrimination according to our Constitution and international treaties on human rights. This law establishes the obligation to create public policies that combat racism and discrimination with a gender-based and generational perspective at all levels of our government. These public policies are designed and implemented through a National Committee Against Racism and Discrimination. The members of this committee come from social organizations such as indigenous groups, Afro-Bolivian groups, cultural groups, women's associations, among others. There are also mechanisms to protect and defend individuals who have been victims of racism or discrimination, and they can seek criminal or administrative redress. We also have celebrated the Day Against All Forms of Discrimination on May 24th every year. We also work with our education system and public agencies to carry out public education activities to raise awareness to combat racism and discrimination. Unfortunately, we still see racist and discriminatory practices which threatens the social cohesion in our country. There is hate speech that persists in our society, especially in the political realm. And we have heard from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on this very issue. It published a country report in 2023 to that effect. The government of Bolivia has various mechanisms to promote a summit to fight racism and discrimination. This offers opportunities to address and fight violence, hate speech, and discrimination, and to identify the causes of these phenomena. It also aims to work to eliminate colonialism, the patriarchy, and other practices. But this is a difficult path. We have an ombudsperson and an observatory on racism and discrimination to monitor these phenomena and prevent such crimes. Chair, the government of Bolivia is firmly committed to the eradication of all forms of discrimination and racism in our country, in our region, and throughout the world. For this reason, we have ratified the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We have also signed the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance, and the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. We are working to ratify it soon. I thank you. Thank you very much to the delegation of Bolivia. I offer the floor to the Ambassador of Uruguay. Thank you, Chair. When we address issues of discrimination, at the heart of it, what we're talking about is what type of societies we want to have. Democratic societies work to raise awareness about this scourge. And it is also clear that progress has been made to address various groups that suffer from this discrimination, intolerance, superiority, harassment, and silence. And they also suffer from being invisible. these minority groups are often invisible in our societies. And it's curious to note that as we've been talking about how serious this issue is, and we've talked about the only path forward that exists to eliminate this scourge, which is education. Education. Education again. Information. It means teaching civic values. It means building a cradle of democracy so that we can enshrine these principles in our laws, enshrine the principle that we are all equal. I remember just a personal anecdote from a few decades ago. There was an amendment to the legal code of my country. It had to do with discrimination, and it added the category of sexual preference and identity. That was added as a category. Specific mention was made of it to include this reality. These groups that have had their rights violated. We live with discrimination. We live with discrimination towards people of African descent on the continent. And it is truly terrible how we live with this discrimination also against indigenous groups who have suffered from this historically. We also live with discrimination in all of its dimensions. We live with discrimination towards Jews. Jewish people practically everywhere around the planet have suffered from discrimination. They've had their rights violated. And they have been viewed unfavorably. And sadly, this is part of our day-to-day reality. On our continent, we live alongside migrants. And sometimes they're not migrants. They're people who have suffered from forced displacement. And this may affect various groups, Cubans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans. And we see discrimination there against those groups as well. That is discrimination. That is discrimination first and foremost. And more than discrimination, it's violence. And violence flies in the face of the principles that we have agreed to promote, democratic values. There can be no democracy with discrimination. There can be no democracy with this type of intolerance. Strengthening multilateralism, therefore, must be based on agreements. We must find points of convergence. But above all, we need to be able to work together as states to change these realities. If we do not change these realities, then we're failing. And it's important not to fail. We cannot fail. Thank you, Chair.
Muchas gracias al embajador de Uruguay.
Thank you very much, Uruguay. Guatemala has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, Guatemala commends the efforts to counter the forms of intolerance and discrimination throughout the region. We appreciate Mexico's point on the agenda. In the world of human rights, it should be the main pillar of our actions. We cannot overlook the challenges that different groups of vulnerable populations address. As a country, we look at this process as an opportunity to understand and eradicate the scourge that leads to discrimination and elimination in our societies. We look for justice. This is something that is shared, but also it's an ineluctable responsibility to deal with these structural issues in our region. The various groups of populations, including women, people with disabilities, young people, indigenous peoples, and Afro-descendants, have the inalienable right to live free of racism, discrimination, and exclusion. This is a turning point, a moment of reflection on the progress made, but also an opportunity to recommit to justice and respect for diversity as we build more inclusive societies and resilient ones. We cannot talk about sustainable development without guaranteeing full-fledged participation of all people. In this regard, the declaration and the programs of action from Durban have placed a fundamental pillar in the overall efforts to analyze racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and all related forms of intolerance. These world regional instruments lead us to collective action as to the urgency of dealing with structural issues. Guatemala reaffirms its commitment to these principles and guides its actions towards respect, inclusion, and human dignity. It's our conviction that dialogue and regional cooperation are crucial to eradicate this problem. Guatemala makes a clarion call to the international community so that we can redouble our efforts and work together to promote public inclusive policies, to strengthen protection mechanisms behind human rights and empowering groups that have been historically marginalized. Only working together will we have a joint commitment strengthening national institutions and multilateral institutions. Only in this way can we move towards societies where equality and justice are a reality in countries of the Americas and in the entire world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. The delegation of the Dominican Republic has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I would like to express our sincerest thanks to the delegation of Mexico for having requested inclusion of this very important topic on the Council's agenda. The panelists, we thank for their presentations. Mr. Chairman, the Dominican Republic, as a social and democratic state respecting rights, looks towards upholding fundamental rights. We organize ourselves as a community place before the law, and it's a constitutional and essential right. In this regard, then, our Constitution Indent 39 says that all people are born free and equal before the law. They receive the same treatment for everyone, all institutions, and they have and enjoy the same rights, the same opportunities without any discrimination for reasons of gender, color, age, disability, nationality, family origin, religion, belief, political opinion, philosophical belief, or personal or philosophical view. Mr. Chairman, the Dominican Republic has made significant efforts to fight against all forms of discrimination in our region. These efforts include ratification of various international instruments, as well as our co-sponsorship of various declarations in international organizations. Our nation has the firm commitment on these topics, as is evinced by our participation in various instruments, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Program of Action, the Durban Program of Action, approved in the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and all related forms of intolerance. Resolutions 65, 67 of the General Assembly of the United Nations that proclaimed the Decade for Afro-Descendants, 2020-2024, under the motto Afro-Descendants, Recognition, Justice, and Development. The Inter-American Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against People with Disabilities, and the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discriminations against women. In the educational arena, Afro descent is part of the Dominican reality in the primary and secondary schools within the area of social science. And our educational programs also include topics that are related to culture, peace, and rights and duties of citizens, which contributes to mutual respect and the prevention of discrimination in educational entities. With a view to raising awareness of the population on topics of equality and non-discrimination, the Dominican state has implemented a host of different educational measures. Let me underscore the efforts and capacity building for public servants and people who work in the criminal system. We do this with a view to guaranteeing rights and avoiding anything else. These trainings impart in social institutions of the state, such as National School for Judicial Affairs, the Public Ministry Institutes, the Higher Institution of Law and Human Rights, in addition to other entities in the educational arena. Mr. Chairman, the Ministry of Women of the Dominican Republic has implemented the National Plan of Equality and Gender Mainstreaming 2020-2030. This aligns with the national policy of equality. And this is according to the principles in our institution, or I should say our Constitution, for sustainable development, promotes dignity of entities with a view to having a more inclusive society. Similarly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Roberto Alvarez, has underscored the priority of the Dominican government to strengthen public policies to eliminate any form of discrimination or violence against women. In his comments to the General Assembly of the OAS in 2021, he underscored the need to invest more resources into the SIM so as to implement programs that are geared towards women's rights, gender equality, and eradication of violence against women. Or in the General Assembly of the OAS, we had the main motto, "Together Against Inequality and Discrimination." Minister Alvarez supported adoption of the Lima Declaration, focusing on the same issue. And then, finally, the Dominican Republic reaffirms its commitment in the fight against discrimination, all of its forms, and its provision, and continues to work to build a more fair, just world for everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to the delegation of the DR. Panama has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This delegation truly appreciates the inclusion of this topic to counteract intolerance and discrimination. We appreciate this item on the agenda today. We truly value Mexico's leadership in promoting this very important topic, as well as the participation of the various panelists. Panama reaffirms its commitment, its unwavering commitment to eradicate all forms of intolerance and discrimination in our region. As a multicultural, pluriethnic, and multilingual nation, we understand that diversity is a strength that enriches our identity and promotes full-fledged development of our peoples. So along that line, we have adopted specific measures to fight against discrimination and to promote inclusion. In 2023, during the commemoration of Black ethnics, we had the development of Afro-Panamanians, and we established an institution to promote public policies that ensure full-fledged equitable population of Afro-descendant population in all spheres of national life. Furthermore, we recognize that education is a fundamental pillar in the fight against intolerance, and that's why we've implemented educational programs that underscores history and contributions of the various communities that make up our country, and as such promoting a culture of respect and valuing diversity from very early on. As part of our good practices, we have promoted intercultural dialogues and implementation of inclusive policies that aim to slash barriers and offer opportunities for all citizens, irrespective of their ethnic origin, gender, religion, or any other condition. Nonetheless, we are well aware that there's still a lot of ground to cover. Intolerance and discrimination continue in various forms, and it is our responsibility all together to identify and make efforts to eradicate those things. In this regard, Panama truly appreciates regional cooperation, the efforts made thereof from the OAS, as well as the opportunities to have these kinds of valuable exchanges where we share experiences and we develop joint strategies. Then, finally, we reaffirm Panama's commitment to work hand in hand with all countries in the hemisphere as we build a region free of intolerance and discrimination. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. The delegation of Ecuador has the floor. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, permanent representatives, alternate Secretary General, and all present. We truly appreciate this valuable comments made and the comments made by delegations who have already spoken. We are committed to fight against intolerance and discrimination in all forms and uphold all human rights. We have public policies to eliminate discrimination, direct or indirect, based on gender or anything else. Just to give you an example, we have worked together with the police and have had more cooperation in 2023. As has been said, this leads to the building of our societies and to work towards a more just or fair society. This guarantees that women in the country can have opportunities with dignity. There are opportunities to have full-fledged participation for all women. This center is a point of hope for empowering women so that each woman can find protection and the necessary space to live a dignified life. On the other hand, our administration and our president has a cabinet that has worked in this regard. In Ecuador, of the current policy of the government, there are commitments to eradicate violence and discrimination because of sexual orientation and any other genetic feature. We work to discrimination in the work area. We guarantee access to education that is accessible and of quality. We want to eliminate all forms of stigma and discrimination, and we work with an intervention plan with civil society organizations. On the other hand, the Ministry of Economic and Social Affairs works actively in implementing policies, programs, and services to prevent violation of rights and to guarantee these rights, particularly emphasizing vulnerable populations, including Afro-Ecuadorians and others, showing the state's commitment to reduce inequality and eliminate structural and historical discrimination. The government has signed 130 conventions to pay attention to the different areas involved. And in this regard, we have put in 27 some odd $million so that we have more public cooperation. This will allow us to provide more coverage of more than 223 groups and priority groups that are vulnerable. Ecuador has implemented policies to eliminate discrimination. We have had people who are in vulnerable situations with whom we work. These services are done with organizations in civil society and other autonomous governments. This is so as to look at programs that fight discrimination. Now, in the case of xenophobia and discrimination, we provide legal services. We follow up these issues in public or private institutions according to the needs they have. Now, with regards to capacity building, the Ministry of Human Rights and Women, we have capacity building programs and awareness raising programs as we have in the International Pact for trainings which are carried out by various organizations in the state. We look to eradicate all kinds of intolerance and discrimination despite the major challenges that we have with organized crime. We are looking towards a new horizon. Thank you very much. Ecuador, Argentina has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We would also like to echo the thanks for including this item on the agenda of this council meeting, as well as our thanks to all the panelists. Their comments have been taken due note of by this delegation. The delegation of Argentina would like to begin its comments offering the first part of the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man. All men are born free and equal with dignity and with their rights. And given this, they have to live together. Now, this is the most interesting bedrock so that we can honor human dignity. Nonetheless, in man, there is violence, and there is the privilege vis-a-vis others, and the right means that we have to give each and every one in social life equal dignity, without which there's no reason to talk about rights. Now, this is very clear in the declarations, conventions, and the regional treaties that are universal. And they look at some of the rights. We do this with a promotion to promote justice, which is part of a collective struggle to slash oppression. This is the critical theory of rights, anti-discriminatory rights, and today we see this in various areas of international and regional dialogue. This theory has been the subject of academic critique, and this has to do with the principle of equality, nonetheless. We are looking at corrective measures. We have to interpret international law, which speaks about structural inequalities. Now, by definition, the skepticism presupposes that some people are vulnerable, which has not been contemplated. But this criticism has to do with these theories that have to do with parity. And there's a lot of victimization. So these criticisms have to do with the principles and theories, and they're very theoretical, but not too much impact in the real daily life of people. There's a lot of dogmatism that exists and an oppressive structure. The defenders of these theories are based on idea of curbing participation of people in daily life. And this leads to resistance, oftentimes, in multilateral environments. For this, there is the concept, such as disinformation, intolerance, that cancels out human rights. In international law and cultural colonialism that doesn't allow for many things, that invokes and leads to social divisions and conflicts instead of inclusion. And it doesn't change the life of anybody because of these theories. More than anything that is palpable for everybody, we look at some of these explanations and look at some of the progress that has been made. Now, perhaps it's self-criticism, but we need to have the capacity to listen and opening up for new horizons and a change of the scenario, because the discussion of human rights has to be fluid. Thank you very much. Argentina, Canada has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our colleague from Mexico for having put this very important item on the agenda today, and also thanks to all the presenters for their comments and presentations. Intolerance and discrimination leads to thoughts thoughts and reflections on this system. Canada is a very enthusiastic member, and we believe in freedom or liberty for each and every one that should be fully respected. We believe in all forms of the fight against racism and any other kinds of prejudice based on racial identity. In English,
prejudice and racism. In Canada, racism is a lived reality faced by Indigenous people, Black, Asian, and other racialized communities, including religious minority communities. While we have made progress at home, we know there remains much to be done. Through Canada's anti-racism strategy, we continue to target systemic discrimination, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, using a comprehensive intersectional approach. Canada has also recently released its first ever action plan on combating hate, which aims to tackle hate groups and incidents as well as root causes of systemic racism. Internationally, Canada has long been a champion for diversity and inclusion. Guided by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we continue to respond to the call to build a more peaceful world where human rights and fundamental freedoms are universally respected. Canada seeks constructive opportunities to collaborate with others who are committed to dismantling systemic racism and to advance inclusion and affirm that diversity is key to resilience, strength, prosperity, and the well-being for all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Canada. Chile has the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the delegate from Mexico and Ambassador Baños for her leadership in this session in particular. Since the meeting was convened, we have before us a serious challenge. It looks at how we can counteract intolerance and discrimination. Now, the meeting also looks at some of the challenges in the region, in the Americas, in the most unequal region of the world, more than anywhere else. So what has to be done? What must be done? Well, from Chile's standpoint, we feel that to counteract intolerance and discrimination in this hemisphere is only possible if we correct structural inequalities that work against our citizens, particularly people who are vulnerable. And to do this, it means we have to think about a host of different standards in public policies and in affirmative action. Now, we feel that this is even more difficult because this issue of public policies and standards for affirmative action cannot be static. Now, the commitments can be valuable only if they're reviewed. This is crucial. The first thing that is sure, by way of example, in space and time, and it is also something relevant to think how we adopt these public policies, these standards, for a new kind of phenomenon in time and space. Now, the space of discrimination and intolerance in the digital world, online, cannot just be the only answer. Previous policies for development on these spaces have to be looked at as well. And then there's another phenomenon, Mr. Chairman, and it's crucial: permanent evaluation, because that's the only way that we can incorporate some of the lessons learned. And this objective is key when it comes to other peoples, other states. And we feel that this is of crucial importance. Here we share part of what we're doing in our country in this area. As of 2012, I should say, in Chile, we have the law called Ley Samudio, precisely because of a young man called Mr. Samudio, who was a victim of a hate crime. And the law that has his name, we also have police standards against discrimination, so that we have different spokes, different lines. I'm talking about the gender law from 2019, law on equal marriages since 2021, legislation on social inclusion and non-discrimination of 2022, or a little bit before recognition, legal recognition of Chilean Afro-descendants. Now, each and every one of these laws requires vision, requires follow-up, requires us to move forward, because to deal with intolerance and discrimination is undoubtedly a very complex issue in our societies. And it's in our societies, so that to make good on this challenge, we have to have permanent dialogue, cooperation. We have to slash hate speeches that only multiplies intolerance and discrimination. We have to look at this in a whole, across-the-board way. And we have our firm commitment, because of all of this, with all due respect to human rights in all places. And it is only possible with the guarantee to have full-fledged exercise in conditions of non-discrimination and equality. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ambassador of Chile. The delegation of Haiti has the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. My delegation is very pleased with the initiative that was taken by Mexico to put this topic on the order of business of today's Permanent Council meeting. We would like to use this opportunity to commend all those who have spoken at the beginning of this discussion, which is dealing with a crucial issue for us all. Fighting intolerance and discrimination in all forms has always been an issue of major importance for Haiti. All human beings have dignity, regardless of their color, race, or nationality. The history of Haiti demonstrates this ongoing fight against the most abject forms of oppression, the slave trade, namely, that affected people of African descent for decades. Haiti has stated loudly that discrimination and intolerance have no place within the human family. And here I'd like to recall a historic event when Simón Bolívar visited Haiti to ask for assistance in his combat against colonialism. And the response of the president at the time was immediate. And only one condition was imposed, and that was that he asked Bolívar to take on the commitment to abolish slavery everywhere where he would be able to throw off the yoke of colonialism. However, as is stated in our conventions, this phenomenon exists. And racism is dynamic. It's constantly reinventing itself and emerging in new forms through which it spreads in the political, social, linguistic, and cultural realms. This phenomenon, however abject it may be, persists today in different forms than what we saw before. There are victims in the region. Very often they are minorities, particularly people of African descent, indigenous groups, as well as other minorities. Migrants in particular, including those from my country, are very often in this category. My delegation calls for member states to be vigilant. And the same goes for our organization, because we see a resurgence of nationalistic, xenophobic groups that want to divide our societies based on racial and ethnic origins or religious belief. Chair, the government of Haiti reiterates its deep commitment to the principles enshrined in the conventions that we have signed and ratified. Accession to these conventions is proof of Haiti's commitment to continue to fully play its role to fight racism and discrimination in the region. Our institutions in Haiti have implemented important monitoring mechanisms to also help implement public policies in line with the obligations that we have in this area. In terms of recommendations, about implementing these mechanisms. We are working to eradicate discrimination and intolerance. We must work together to fight this scourge and bring definitive answers and solutions. Chair, Haiti is pursuing these efforts and is working to put appropriate public policies in place to further its contribution to combating discrimination and intolerance in all of its forms. Thank you.
Gracias, la delegación de Haití, la delegación de San...
I offer the floor to St. Kitts and Nevis.
Thank you, Chair, and warm and fraternal greetings to all delegations and observers. My delegation would like to join others in expressing special thanks to the delegation of Mexico for placing this item on the agenda. Chair and colleagues, the government of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis is proud of its record of non-discrimination on all levels. Our Constitution of 1983 guarantees equal rights of all citizens, including the 10% of our population who are not necessarily of African descent. We are all one. This is important to us because we clearly remember the negative effects of colonialism and slavery, some of which still linger, but we will eradicate all of it once and for all once we continue our positive, progressive trajectory and we maintain our course. We are positive of that. More recently, Chair, we have passed legislation to protect the rights of marginalized groups, such as the Rastafarian movement, and we have protected their religious ceremonies and sacraments. Legislation has also been enacted to ensure equal rights of women who enjoy upward mobility in all areas of our society. There is also equal access to health care, delivery, and education, which is free from kindergarten to college. Non-discrimination, Chair, is non-discrimination, and St. Kitts and Nevis believes that it must be across the board. It is for this reason that we continue the clarion call for the end of the discriminatory embargo against our fellow Caribbean brothers and sisters in Cuba, with a population that is predominantly of mixed, indigenous, and Afro-descendant ethnicity. Chair, we observe that there are other countries of similar political and ideological structures that are not subjected to the same type of trade and economic discrimination. So we again call for this failed and unfair system to end, even if it were to be just from a humanitarian point of view. Wrongful discrimination needs to be completely eradicated from our states, the hemisphere, and indeed the world. May it please you, Chair.
Muchas gracias.
I thank the delegation of St. Kitts and Nevis. We have concluded our list of speakers, and I would ask for your indulgence now. I would like to close this topic by welcoming Mr. Carlos Quesada, Executive Director of the Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights. He had some connectivity issues a moment ago, but now he is able to speak and share his remarks with us. Sir, go ahead. You have the floor.
Parece que el problema.
Unfortunately, it seems like the same issue is still happening, says the chair.
Bueno, con las disculpas del caso.
Apologies. It seems that these technical issues are ongoing. Now, having heard from all of the delegations and member states, we would like to express our thanks to the distinguished panelists for their remarks, as well as all delegations who took the floor. Your input has greatly enriched our debate and collective reflection on how to combat racism and discrimination in our continent. The chair suggests that the Permanent Council take note of the presentations and remarks that were made. These will be reflected in the minutes of this meeting in accordance with the mandate set out in Resolution 3028, and the General Assembly will be hereby informed at its next regular meeting. Seeing no objections, it is so agreed. Colleagues, let us now move to the next item. Consideration of the draft resolution entitled The General Committee of the Permanent Council and the Periodic Review of Working Methods and Procedures. This is presented to the Permanent Council at the request of the permanent missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Bolivia, and Brazil through a note distributed as document CP Doc 6063/25, and it is co-sponsored by the delegations of Mexico and Colombia. Colleagues, the General Committee is one of the 5 fundamental bodies of this Permanent Council, as set out in Article 14 of the Rules of Procedure, along with the Committee of Juridical and Political Affairs, the Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Affairs, the Committee on Hemispheric Security, and the Committee on the Management of Inter-American Summits and participation by civil society in OAS activities. However, the General Committee has been inactive for several years, mainly due to budget issues. At the General Assembly last June, held in Paraguay, in Asunción, the correct decision was made to enable the Permanent Council to reactivate the General Committee so that it can carry out the work entrusted to it by Article 16 of our Rules of Procedure. And this was duly fulfilled by the Permanent Council at its meeting on 24 July 2024. In addition, the General Assembly has also asked the Secretariat to provide services, and this is ongoing. Now, based on paragraph C of Article 16 of the Permanent Council's Rules of Procedure, the General Committee is tasked with periodically reviewing, by mandate of the Permanent Council, the procedures and work methods in order to improve efficiency and best use the time allotted for its activities. In that vein, the permanent missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Bolivia, and Brazil, with the co-sponsorship of Mexico and Colombia, have presented this draft resolution with the aim of creating a broad participatory mechanism to improve work procedures and methods in order to achieve the greatest transparency and efficiency possible. The draft has received valuable input from the delegations of Costa Rica and Paraguay, and these have been included into this draft, which aims to be broadly inclusive and participatory. Without further ado, I would now like to offer the floor to the Ambassador of Brazil, and I would like to thank him in advance for his leadership in this important work. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimmer. The delegation of Brazil is honored to introduce the draft resolution called General Committee of the Permanent Council, Procedures and Methods for Work, as we have it in document CP Doc 6063/25 Rev 3, co-sponsored by Antigua and Barbuda, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Here we're talking about a topic that my delegation has tried to underscore for some time now and has made reference to. We have a joint declaration on commitment shared to guarantee open negotiations which are transparent and inclusive, signed by 17 member states and was looked at 17th of October, about a year ago. We have deepened our talks with various members in the regional groups with a view to using the existent mechanisms to refine the procedures and to strengthen legal views and transparency in the deliberation so that we have efficiency and the best use of time given the resources that are before us. With this goal, the Special General Assembly, through resolution called Program Budget of the Organization for 2025, entrusted the Permanent Council to ask the General Committee to do its work in Article 16 of the regulation. This is Article 22 of the resolution. This resolution also approved the necessary resources for meetings of the General Committee. The draft resolution, which I am honored to introduce today, ensures an adequate follow-up of the General Assembly's decision, establishing the General Committee that should follow this up in a practical way according to Article 16 of the regulation, which specifically says the General Committee has the function of, I quote, periodically examining the mandate of the Permanent Council and the practice of working methods and procedures so as to get best efficiency possible and the best use of time in its work, end quote. The approval of the draft resolution thus aims to comply with the mandate already approved by the General Assembly to have a time frame to review working methods and procedures and to come up with results. Through the General Assembly, we have an examination and discussion on eventual tweaks that are deemed necessary and an open process in doing so. The reasons for the exercise were spoken about in details in the conceptual note, which was accompanied and circulated on this draft on the 7th of February, as we have it announced by my delegation at the special meeting on the 5th of February. Given the suggestions that we got from various delegations, we incorporated everything. So, Mr. Chairman, we are in a position to use the General Committee to exchange ideas on the importance of making the necessary adjustments that will have an impact, as was the case on the 15th of January, when different or divergent interpretations led to the approval of the agenda and caused harm because of the scarce resources as well as the public image of the Council. Now, clearly, we will all win with what we have in the document. This is not to open up across-the-board reforms, but to use what we have before us, as we have in the regulation. The aim is to have an informed participation of all delegations, both in preparing these sessions as well as in the deliberations. This will avoid, in addition to other challenges, ambiguous rules or vague rules, insufficient time, linguistic barriers, which cause problems in terms of the efficient use of time and the time available. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Brazil. I give the floor to the Ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The delegation of Antigua and Barbuda was pleased to be associated with the distinguished delegations of Bolivia and Brazil in proposing this resolution concerning the review of our procedures and working methods. Antigua and Barbuda has had the privilege of officially chairing the Permanent Council on 3 different occasions in almost 9.5 years. Therefore, we believe we have a peculiar understanding and a unique understanding of the difficulties that our rules of procedures have presented to this Council and to its member states from time to time. They are certainly in need of review. We regard this initiative, headed up by the ambassadors of Brazil and Bolivia, to which we were pleased to lend a hand, is both timely and essential for the following reasons. First, the General Assembly has entrusted the Permanent Council with reactivating the General Committee to fulfill its designated functions. Therefore, adopting this resolution ensures our adherence to this mandate, reflecting our commitment to the directives established by our member states at the highest level of this organization. Second, the implementation of this resolution will empower the General Committee to assess and recommend enhancement to our procedures so as to achieve our collective goal of achieving the highest possible level of efficiency. By optimizing our working methods, we can better serve the interests of our member states and the broader objectives of the organization. Third, the resolution outlines a clear framework for action, mandating the General Committee to submit its recommendations within a specific time frame. This structured approach not only facilitates timely deliberation by the Permanent Council, but also underscores our dedication to proactive and responsive governance. Fourth, the General Assembly has approved the necessary resources to support the sessions of the General Committee, so financing the work is not an issue. By adopting this resolution, we are ensuring that these allocated resources are utilized effectively, thereby upholding the principles of fiscal responsibility and organizational accountability. Fifth, by considering potential normative adjustments, we demonstrate our readiness to evolve and adapt our institutional frameworks. And lastly, this draft resolution was made available to all delegations in a timely manner, providing for comments and suggestions from member states which have been taken fully into account. The commitment to continuous improvement embodied in this resolution will enhance the transparency and predictability of our operations, thereby reinforcing the trust and confidence of all sectors of our own countries and also of the international community. In light of these considerations, my delegation fully supports the statement just made by the distinguished Ambassador of Brazil and moves, Mr. Chairman, that this Council adopt the resolution before us by consensus, and I so move.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the Ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda. I offer the floor to the Ambassador of the Bahamas.
Good morning, all. Please accept my, sorry.
No va a presentar ninguna observación.
Did you want to make a remark, Bahamas?
Antigua and Barbuda, who's moved for the resolution to be adopted by consensus, or by acclamation. Is it consensus? Acclamation.
Consulto.
I do have a minor amendment, so I can join the consensus, but it'll be a little complicated.
La idea, distinguidos colegas.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, Ambassador of the Bahamas. The idea then is to listen and see if we can have consensus and then adopt it. Ambassador, we can first hear from the Ambassador of the Bahamas. Please go ahead, Ambassador.
Again, sincerest apologies as also to the proponents. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the delayed nature of the request and comments that my delegation will now present. And again, ironically, Sir Ronald has frequently admonished and reminded me with a touch of humor that I am likely to arrive late at my own funeral, and I admit that I am a work in progress. Chair, the delegation of the Bahamas wishes to extend its deepest respect to you and your esteemed delegation, as well as the delegations of Bolivia, Antigua, Barbuda, and Brazil for their invaluable contributions to the presentation of this significant endeavor. We'd also like to acknowledge the co-sponsorships. At the outset, Chair, I would like to reassure you of my delegation's unwavering support for this draft resolution. In that spirit, and to further demonstrate our commitment, we would respectfully request to be included as a co-sponsor of this important initiative. And Chair, also given our vested interest in these matters, we trust that our observations will be received in the constructive spirit in which they are offered with the intention of enhancing the proposed reforms. We trust that, wherever possible, these observations can be incorporated into the draft resolution. For context, this initiative is a recommendation stemming from the agenda item 2 of the May 17, 2024 retreat of the Permanent Council, which was conducted under the chairmanship of the Bahamas. It is worth noting that this event was also co-hosted by the Ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda in his capacity as the Dean of the Corps of the Permanent Representatives. Furthermore, the proposal to reactivate and re-engage the General Committee was elaborated upon and ultimately emerged in 2 critical touch points. First, it appeared as one of the 35 priority recommendations in the Alvarez and Marsal Comprehensive Third-Party Review of the OAS, specifically under the governance rubric as item 2B1. Secondly, the proposal is underpinned by the 2025 budget resolution, which was also appropriated resources for its implementation. Chair, we recognize and agree that the review is not intended to be a complete, broad, and unrestricted review of all rules, and we align ourselves with that understanding. That said, and with the greatest respect, my delegation suggests that given the overriding objectives of this proposal, it may prove more beneficial to conduct a simultaneous or related review wherever feasible of both the statutes of the Permanent Council and the rules of procedure of the General Assembly alongside the review of the General Committee. The statutes of the Permanent Council forms the primary legislation, while the rules are subsidiary, drawing much of their authority from the statutes. Furthermore, the rules of procedure of both the Permanent Council and the General Assembly are derived from the same foundational principles. However, there is no corresponding provision, item 16C, in the General Assembly Rules of Procedure that mandates a periodic review. Notably, the General Assembly itself also has a General Committee with procedures that parallel those of the Permanent Council. Therefore, should we proceed with reforms to the Permanent Council and the General Assembly separately, or leave the General Assembly rules out of this modernization process, there may be inherent risks. It is important to highlight that Article 91 of the Charter established the unique amphibious role of the Permanent Council as it functions in its multiple capacities. A, as the implementation arm of the General Assembly and the meeting of consultation of Ministers of Foreign Affairs. B, as a General Assembly when not in session. And C, as the preparatory committee for the General Assembly. The Permanent Council also holds additional responsibilities for other organs as detailed in 91D through G of the Charter. Chair, understanding that this forum is not intended for negotiation of specific terms, my delegation would like to propose a slight amendment to the resolution before us, and this amendment would provide for a related and focused review of both statutes of the Permanent Council and the rules of procedure of the General Assembly to ensure alignment with any amendments resulting from the review of the Permanent Council's rules of procedure. I thank the Council for its kind attention. Again, my delegation would like to be considered a co-sponsor if the consensus is such that if we just review the rules of the Permanent Council and nothing else, my delegation will go along with that as well. My submission is for the record of the Council. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Le voy a ofrecer la palabra.
Thank you, Ambassador. I offer the floor to the Ambassador of Colombia, and please go ahead, sir. Thank you, Chair. Is there a point of order, sir? Ambassador Sanders, I offer you the floor, sir. Give a few minutes to the...
Embajador.
We support Antigua and Barbuda's motion to approve the draft by acclamation. Ambassador Sanders, you have the floor.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the distinguished Ambassador of Colombia for that intervention, because this Council has before it a proper motion for adoption of this resolution by acclamation. And as I recall it in the rules of procedure, if that is asked for by a member state, then that is what should be put before the Council, not a further discussion of the matter. But since I have the floor, may I say that we took great trouble, Mr. Chairman, you in particular, as chair of this council, to ensure that this draft resolution was circulated to all member states in a timely manner for comments. Now, there is great value in what has been said here this morning by the distinguished ambassador and my good friend, the ambassador of the Bahamas, Chet Nemore. However, it is too late, in my view, for that submission to be made at this point. And before us is a proper motion, moved and seconded, and now actually thirded, if there's such a word, but given a third support of a delegation, that we should consider adoption by acclamation. I would add these further words, if I may, sir. There is nothing to stop the General Committee itself by taking account of the remarks that were made here this morning by Ambassador Nemore. So it is not to dismiss the remarks made by the ambassador, and indeed his own experience as the chairman of CAP and also as the chairman of this council is invaluable to all of us. And therefore, I am sure once the General Committee begins its work, it can take account of those remarks. But to try to deal with them now, with member states having not heard or seen them before, would not be correct. It would not be right. It would not give each of the member states the time they need to consider what he has put before us. So, with great respect, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we move to act on the motion that is properly before this council, and that you take account of the remarks that I've made, that Ambassador Nemore's remarks this morning may form part of what goes to the General Committee for its consideration. Thank you very much.
Con esa...
With that clarification and with that suggestion to have the General Committee look at that, I will now ask our members if we can unanimously approve this resolution by acclamation. Seeing no further requests for the floor, it is so approved. Approved. Colleagues, let us now move to consideration of the draft resolution, place and date of the 25th regular session of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, SICTE, convened by Resolution AG Res. 3031 of the General Assembly. This draft has been presented by the distinguished delegation of Ecuador as chair of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, and it was distributed as document CP Doc 6064/25. For this item, I am pleased to offer the floor to the Ambassador of Ecuador, Mauricio Montalvo. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair. Indeed, as chair of SICTE, and in collaboration with the Secretariat of SICTE, we have presented the draft resolution that you just mentioned, as all members are aware of. In terms of the place and date of the 25th regular session of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, which will be convened by Resolution AG Res. 3031, which has to do with promoting hemispheric security and its multidimensional approach. Perhaps the members of the Council will have seen that the dates proposed are May 6 and 7 of this year here at OAS General Secretariat Headquarters. I imagine that there will be no objections, and I assume it will be approved by acclamation. I just want to reiterate that the authorities of Ecuador are working very closely in cooperation with the Executive Secretariat of SICTE, and we hope that all delegations can join in this work and will continue to strengthen the fight against terrorism in all of its forms in the region. I thank you, Chair.
El embajador de Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador of Ecuador. I'd like to consult delegations if we can proceed to approve this resolution put unanimously. As there are no comments, it is so hereby approved. Distinguished colleagues, we're going to have a break that we're due to have now, and we'll be coming back at 2:30. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, the first part of the commemoration of women of the Americas will be in the hands of our vice chair, looking at the valuable contributions of women that we have in our own membership. We truly appreciate your patience and for all of the work in this session, which is of utmost importance for given the topics presented and also for the resolution of the General Committee, which was approved. Our deep thanks to all delegations. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.